sending it to people, I think.
Okay, so today is the 31st of May of 2021, and it's Memorial Day. And that's why I wanted to tell you this story, some of which you've heard before. But unlike Veterans Day, when anybody who served in the armed forces is honored, Memorial Day is when we remember those who actually died in the war, or in wars. And so it's sometimes people say thank you for your service to people like me and others. That's Veterans Day. Yesterday was, and today is when we remember people who died in the war. And in the middle of service, when Father Brian was talking about a particular person, I thought about two people that I know who died in Vietnam, one of whom I served with. But then I remembered being in prison camp in World War II and remembering all the people who died so that all of us could be free and so that you actually could be here today. Because your great-grandmother and your great-grandfather and I spent 3 years in a Japanese prison camp in the Philippine Islands. We went over there. My parents went over in 1938 to be missionaries with the Episcopal Church. I was born in 1940, and in late 1941, the Japanese invaded the Philippines. The Philippines was part of American territory that was later ceded back to the Philippines. But the Japanese invaded, made an unprovoked attack on the Philippine Islands, and then all the civilians who were there were put in a civilian concentration camp. The military who were there and fought against the Japanese were put in a military concentration camp, prisoner of war camp, and they were treated far more cruelly and brutally than the civilian internees, although we were not treated well. So rather than telling you the whole story of prison camp, I thought today I'd bring a couple of remembrances and have us remember those particular military people who died in the particular battle to save us and get us out of the prison camp, okay? But that means that we omit all the people in World War II who died, or all the people throughout our history who died, and concentrate just a little slice of the people who rescued us, and do that so that it personalizes it to our family on this day. So while we were in prison camp, a lot of prison camp is just boredom for civilians, and one of the things that you go by every time you come into our house is this spoon. You might have seen it, and that spoon was made by a friend of ours. What do you say? Oh yes, that's a different set, yeah. This spoon was made by a friend of ours, Mrs. Miller, who, for her, by your great-grandfather when we were in prison camp. He took some brass from a military shell casing and he pounded this. People would have a model to pound it in, and he pounded this spoon and gave it to her as a birthday present.
And the shell is a bullet
model. Yeah, it was a bullet. So this is a shell casing or a bullet casing. And he made this for her on her birthday. She then kept it all the way through the war. And later, when Gaga and I went to Philadelphia for a conference, we saw her and she gave this to me and said, "Your father made this for me and I think it belongs in your home." So something made as a gift in prison camp found its way back into our family.
If you look real
It's
close,
beautiful.
you can see the
Yeah, you can see the pounding.
Yeah, but still,
How do
it's
you-
amazing looking.
Isn't there powder inside of the casing?
Well, yes,
It
the
was
powder
thin.
is in there, and the casing is compressed and hard,
It was
so the
left.
powder explodes and it sends the bullet out.
Got
But the
it.
casing remains complete.
Okay.
So if you see war movies, you'll see shell casings
Yes.
at the foot of a machine gun or something. That would have been a bigger casing than a regular, that could have been an artillery casing because it was bigger and heavier. And people in prison camps made all kinds of things. I have other things that were made, and they make things and save them. So we spent, what's that?
Did they know what a
They
spoon
have
was?
molds.
Yes, they knew what spoons were, and he had a mold to
He had
hammer.
a mold to hammer
You know, like
in.
my gummy bear molds? They had one of those, but it was like for metal, and it made a spoon.
Like a piece of wood.
And the silver that you have up there was part of our silverware that we had from before the war. And when the war came and the Japanese were going to come and get us, my father took the time to bury the silver and a few other things and hide it so that nobody would get it. And the Filipinos knew where we hid it, and they were such honorable, wonderful people. They protected it and saved it. And as the war went down, one of my uncles was in the Philippines in the army, and he drove up there and found this and brought it back after the war. And one thing about this is that Isaiah says they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. It's right in Isaiah and Micah. And this shows that something that was a sword, a shell casing, was beaten into a plowshare, something useful and helpful. So that reminds me of the Bible too. We spent almost all of our time in Camp Holmes up in Baguio City. And then the last 6 weeks of the war, we were moved down to Manila because the Japanese brought prisoners down into Manila to use them as bartering and so forth. We were taken to a terrible prison for the last 6 weeks. On one side, and there's still pictures of it, on one side were military, American military, who'd been there for 3 years. Many of them had died, they were emaciated. And on the other side, they put civilians like us for the 6 weeks. And we were not in good shape, and we were in worse shape after 6 weeks there of existing on about 600 to 800 calories a day. And the Americans came and rescued us. And they rescued us, and the rescue is described in a book. You have a copy of it, and it was the Ohio Regiment, the 37th Ohio Division, that rescued us, and there are all kinds of accounts of it. Where the rescue itself was dangerous, there was only maybe 1 or 2 lives that were lost, but they were lost. And there's the account is of the rescue. And after we were rescued, they were afraid that there was a Japanese ammunition depot nearby that the Japanese army was going to blow up. And so they took us all out and moved us 2 miles away. That's described in the book. Spent the night there, and then brought us back when the U.S. government had captured the ammunition depot. Meanwhile, the Filipinos who lived in Manila, where we were, and didn't know us, they thought, well, the Americans are gone, and this is wartime, and we're hungry, and let's see what we can get. Fair game. They went into prison and took whatever the prisoners had left. And the prisoners had left almost all of what remained of their possessions. So they came back to even less than nothing. And this is a picture about 2 or 3 days after we were released, and it shows your great-grandfather and great-grandmother and me, and that was taken by a U.S. Army photographer. Now notice in there, my father was very, very thin, right? Mm-hmm. And you notice my mother was not quite as thin, but I'm not thin at all, right? And you know why?
There's 2 things.
Hmm?
Either you were just born, or they gave you their food.
That's what I'm thinking of. That's good. The adults, all the adults made sure that all the children had enough to eat. So when you see pictures there, and there are pictures of children in our camp, none of the children are thin and emaciated, but most of the parents are. And even Japanese soldiers during the war.
But did the parents get fed?
Yeah, they gave.
The parents gave their food to the children, and they got a little
just
bit.
enough.
Yeah. And there were Japanese soldiers who loved children just like Americans do, and they made sure that the American children had food as well. So there were even Japanese soldiers who might themselves have been facing death and who left right before the Americans came, who made sure that whatever little food they had, that American children got the food as well. And don't let anybody glorify war and make you think it's glamorous, and movies do that sometimes. And if you ever read the story of the capture of Bilibid, you'll see that it isn't glorious, but it's a blessing to be rescued. And on this Memorial Day, I just thought I'd bring these to share with you to see that the
What's the
Memorial Day, that meant that people gave their lives so that all of us could sit around this table.
Can you read the caption on the photo? Elena was asking.
Sure. Internees of Manila's Bilibid prison for more than 3 years, the Reverend Francis C. Gray, his wife and son Francis Jr., breathed the air of freedom. Francis Jr. was captivated by American soldiers who played with him and tousled his hair. The rescue was effected by soldiers of the 37th Infantry Division who smashed prison gates and annihilated Jap guards.
Yay.
And the word Jap was used in World War II.
How did they know
It's not a good term to use, but it's a World War term. It's a wartime term where people use pejorative names. So there it is.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for letting me come over on Memorial Day and share that.
Thanks for letting us record it.
Was there a name, a person? I think you sent it to us, but do you have a name in mind
Of
when
what?
you're talking about people in particular that you remember who helped rescue your?
In the 37th Division.
In the 37th Division, I don't have a particular name, but there are names. We have lots of names.
Okay.
And there were particular, I did one time preach in in Washington, Alexandria, Virginia, at Christ Church, the historic church that Washington went to, downtown Alexandria, when I was the bishop there. And it was and there was a group of people from Ohio who were there because this church is famous, and they'd bring a tour group in, and they came to service, and it was Memorial Day weekend, and I preached, and I chose to preach on the release of the 37th Division, of us by the 37th Division. And there was somebody in that group who had been in the 37th Division in the war.
Wow.
And he had not actually been one of the actual rescuers, because divisions are big. He had been somewhere else in Manila, but I was able to be in touch with somebody who actually was in that division and knew some of those people. So that's neat. Okay.
Any other questions?
Any other questions? Okay.